as a thought experiment, let's try to step into the sandals of one of the 12 first century Jewish disciples of Jesus who were in attendance at the Last Supper. Now, this event provides us with a striking example of the difference between Torahism and mainstream Christian theology. So the setting is ancient Jerusalem, and it's buzzing with activity because of Pesach, the annual Passover feast. So earlier in the week, Jesus had arrived in Jerusalem riding on a donkey, right, with crowds of people shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." And as a disciple who had been traveling with Jesus for 2 or 3 years, this wasn't going to be your first Passover meal with him, but you sensed there was something special or different about this one. The Jews in Jerusalem were already eating unleavened bread and busily making preparations for the Passover feast, a feast, by the way, that predates Sinai and the law of Moses. Pesach harkens all the way back to Israel's final days in slavery in Egypt. That's when God first gave the command for this feast. And the Jewish people have been keeping it annually ever since. In fact, in Luke 2, when Jesus was still a child, we're told that his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of the Passover. And as a Jewish disciple, you've kept Pesach since you were a child. And your parents kept it since they were children, and your grandparents, and so on, right? We modern-day Christians are a bit removed from the importance and weightiness of Pesach. So let's take a brief look at the event in the Torah. The Passover is introduced in Exodus 12, where Yahweh commanded the Israelites to prepare a sacrifice of a lamb without blemish at twilight, and God gives them specific instructions. Verse 7, "Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire. With unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." And as you know, it's called Passover because the Lord was going to strike the land of Egypt, killing every firstborn as punishment, but he would pass over the houses that had blood on the doorposts and spare them. So God not only saved Israel through that first Passover, he then established it as an ongoing annual feast. Verse 25, "And when you come to the land the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service," Pesach. "And when your children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' you shall say, 'It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses.'" And the Torah gives some additional instructions for the annual feast about avoiding leaven, or yeast as we know it today, removing it out of our houses, and eating unleavened bread for 7 days, and so on. And there's this powerful theological symbolism in God's commands that pointed to Christ, an innocent, unblemished, or sinless sacrifice, salvation coming through the shedding of innocent blood. But of course, that theological significance wouldn't be revealed until centuries later when Jesus became the ultimate Passover sacrifice. What the living God ordained all along, we humans can only see in hindsight. So the Israelites wouldn't have made those connections, nor would have Yeshua's own Jewish disciples, at least not until after the resurrection. So the keeping of Pesach was based around these holy texts in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which was the only scripture that Jesus and his disciples had. There was no New Testament at that time, right? They were living the New Testament. So these Old Testament passages were the backdrop for the Jewish disciples of Jesus. Pesach was their national story of salvation and an annual rhythm that they'd kept going all the way back to Moses. So as a Jewish disciple, this is what was on your mind. It was the context from which you operated that whole week as you prepared for the Passover feast with Yeshua. So we're in first century Jerusalem, walking alongside Jesus, and it's Passover. And let's pick up in Luke 22 at verse 7. "Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it.' They said to him, 'Where will you have us prepare it?' He said to them, 'Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and tell the master of the house, 'The teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there.' And they went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover." So try to picture the scene as we enter that large furnished upper room where Peter and John prepared the Passover. This is probably going to be your second or third Pesach Seder with Jesus. And now the Passover meal is typically held by a family, and the head of the household hosts the event. But in this case, with you and 11 other disciples, Jesus is the head and the host of Pesach. And the Passover Seder celebrated by Jesus and his disciples would have been different than a modern-day Jewish Seder, right? For example, modern Jews don't make the sacrifice of a lamb. The Passover Seder as we know it today actually didn't develop until after the first century, during the age of Rabbinic Judaism. But the Last Supper can certainly be viewed as a sort of primitive Seder. The wine and the bread and the washing that we read about in the New Testament are all in keeping with the Torah celebration of Pesach. Now, we're not sure if first century Jews asked some form of manishtana, the 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights, right? But they likely retold the Passover story from Exodus in some way, and there would have been the blessing over the wine, the Kaddish, and the matzah bread would have been distributed, and there would have been some form of urchatz, or ritual washing. And this entire event, this feast, is grounded not just in Hebrew culture, but in the historic calling and saving of the Hebrew people, which is why the Torah commanded Pesach as an annual remembrance of Yahweh's salvation by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And remember, from a theological perspective, as a disciple sitting in that room with Jesus, you don't have a clear picture of what was coming in the next 3 days. You probably don't fully realize that you're about to partake in what will later be referred to as the Last Supper. And you wouldn't have understood that everything in Yeshua's earthly ministry had led to the events of this week. For 3 years, you walked alongside Jesus as he taught and healed and called and loved and challenged the religious authorities and performed miracles and prophesied and lived a perfect example. And somewhere along the way, you began to believe that he was the Christ, the promised Messiah foretold in your own Hebrew scriptures. But what that fully entailed, you couldn't have known at the time. This week was the culmination of the very reason that God became flesh and dwelt among us. This was the whole point of Yeshua's mission. And you have to wonder what Jesus must have been thinking at that table with his closest friends. They had been through so much together, and he knew one of them was going to betray him. And as they made small talk and he looked around the room, he knew that tomorrow he would be turned over to the Roman authorities and brutally crucified. And here, on the eve of his suffering, he broke bread with his disciples, his brothers, and he knew that everything was about to change. Tomorrow he'd be crucified, and on Sunday he would walk out of the grave, and nothing would be the same ever again. His beloved disciples were going to be heartbroken and confused and ultimately overjoyed. And the world wouldn't fully understand what all this meant for decades, maybe even centuries. So even as Jesus took hold of the matzah bread prepared for the Seder, he knew that this was a meal that would be remembered forever. And the words he spoke next would echo down through the centuries. Now, whether his disciples knew it or not, this was his grand farewell speech. And yet all 12 Jewish disciples reclining at the table for yet another Passover Seder were prepared for Jesus to lift the matzah bread and say a traditional Pesach blessing like, "This is the bread of affliction which our forefathers ate in Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let him come and celebrate Pesach." And then he would hold up the wine and speak the Kaddish. "Blessed art thou, O Lord, who has created the fruit of the vine." But that's not what happened at all, is it? Luke 22 says, "And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" Wow. Think about those words as if you were a Jewish disciple sitting there, hearing them out of your rabbi's mouth. What do you mean this bread is your body? What do you mean in remembrance of you? You're sitting here right in front of me. And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." Your blood? What do you mean by the new covenant? Are you talking about the prophecy of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah? As a disciple expecting a traditional Passover Seder, this would have come as a big surprise. And maybe as a disciple of Jesus, you're used to him doing surprising things. But here, Yeshua was taking a centuries-old Hebrew institution commanded in the Torah and pointing it towards himself. Now, the New Testament writers provide really just a skeletal narrative of this meal, right? They left out a lot of detail in order to focus on the most essential point. So if the discussion around the table included the exodus out of Egypt and the Torah commands about leaven and eating in haste and all the rest, if that was talked about, none of the gospel writers mentioned it. Rather, they all focused their accounts of this historic meal on the farewell message of Jesus. And what did he say? What words did he want to leave for his disciples, and by extension, all believers today? Well, rather than pointing us to the Torah, or to Moses, or to Egypt and the historical roots of Pesach, Jesus declared that Passover was all about him. Just like in the synagogue in Nazareth when he applied the words of Isaiah 61 to himself. Here in the upper room, at a meal that the Torah commanded as an annual reminder to Israel of their rescue from Egypt, Yeshua didn't mention Israel or Egypt or the Torah or Moses or leaven. Instead, he commanded something new, that as often as you eat the spread and drink of the wine, do so in remembrance of him. I mean, let that sink in. Jesus chose the setting of the Pesach Seder to proclaim that the new covenant had arrived. And he appropriated the bread and the wine and gave them new meaning. This is my body and my blood. Eat and drink in remembrance of me. And he didn't say, this is the renewed covenant in my blood, right? He wasn't renewing the Passover feast. No. Passover certainly foreshadowed the crucifixion. I mean, salvation through blood, right? But guess what? Pesach had nothing to say about a resurrection or about victory over death and sin. And the resurrection is the single most important event in the history of the human race. Paul says it's the linchpin of the Christian faith. And God ordained from the beginning of time that his Son would not only die, not only shed his innocent blood, but also be resurrected during Pesach. And while Jesus certainly and flawlessly kept Pesach his entire earthly life, he never commanded anyone else to do so. And at his last Passover meal with his disciples, Jesus claimed the Pesach elements for himself. The bread, the wine, even the washing. In Jewish tradition, there's a ceremonial Passover washing called urchatz, where the host of the Seder washes his hands to ritually purify himself during the meal. Now, in John's account of the Last Supper, in John 13, we find that Jesus staged a sort of reversal of urchatz. Rather than washing himself before the meal, he instead washed his disciples' dusty, grimy feet. This was a profound object lesson in humility. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, taking a towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Did you catch that? Jesus knew that the Father had given all things into his hands. All authority on heaven and earth had been given to Jesus, and what did he do with it? Did he command them to keep Pesach every year forever? No. He got down on his knees and he served his sinful, fallible human disciples, the ones who didn't really understand what he was saying and would even betray him. Verse 12, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you." So again, Jesus commandeered the Passover elements for himself. And the truth is, they were pointing to him the entire time. To use Paul's analogy from Colossians 2, they were the shadows, but Jesus is the substance. And don't miss the importance that this was a Seder, a Passover meal. The eating of food in Scripture is often far more than just refueling our bodies. As Chad Bird points out, in Hebrew theological categories, to eat is to acknowledge that we're not self-sufficient, that life comes from outside of us as a gift. We need food like we need God, who is the ultimate provider of our food, which is the idea behind the concept of fasting. I mean, think about it. In the garden, with the forbidden food, Adam and Eve weren't looking to the Lord, but to themselves. They'd been deceived, and every human being after them would pay the price. And it was through food that God brought salvation to his people. He miraculously provided the wandering Israelites with manna and quail in the wilderness. And of course, while still in slavery in Egypt, the Passover meal signaled the rescue of Israel as a nation. And that rescue is precisely what Jesus and his disciples were celebrating during that Last Supper. Their minds would have certainly been focused on God's saving work. And the bread and wine that Jesus served was the beginning of the reversal of that infamous bite of food taken in the Garden of Eden that sent the world into sin and brokenness. Jesus came to turn all that around. So at the Last Supper, the phrase "take and eat" was infused with an entirely new meaning. So the Last Supper really highlights the difference between Torahism and mainstream Christian theology. Because whereas our Hebrew roots friends want to point us toward the Torah and toward Moses and toward God's appointed feasts for Israel, that's not what Jesus did. Jesus pointed us to himself. Our Hebrew roots friends tell us that we shouldn't celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday, but that we should instead keep the Passover. But that's not what Jesus said. He said to eat the bread and drink the wine in remembrance of him.